Hey everybody, this is Cyrus. Welcome to Afterlife Topics, coming at you from a brisk afternoon in Kiev, Ukraine. This is my second time doing this video. I shot this yesterday morning and I was just about to head off to the class I'm taking, the CELTA for English teachers, and very stressful class. So 7 o'clock is when I wake up, and then I'll get back until like 6 p.m. at night. And so I could tell like the stress and the preoccupation on my thoughts was coming through that video. I watched it again and I was just like, I am not on form in this video. So I'm going to redo it. So that's what we're doing now. As always, please consider supporting the channel, liking the video, subscribing if you haven't done so yet, or become a patron over at patreon.com/afterlife topics, or afterlifetopics.com/university. Get involved in classes, work with me one-on-one, go behind the scenes with guest interviews, all that kind of stuff, and pretty much keeps this channel going. Without the help from viewers like you, I wouldn't really be able to stack my afterlife work with everything else I do. So definitely need that if you like this kind of work. To begin, so the higher self. I want to talk a little bit about what the higher self is and my theory about how the higher self in a way is dependent upon its so-called lesser self, why these two things are not why these two things are not necessarily as separable as people think. This is just kind of my theory from studying this area for a while, hearing a lot of NDEs, for example, and also a little bit about what the higher self is and how this probably affects all of us on our own journeys in life, and developing a relationship with the higher self, why this is a key in kind of personal happiness, success, and understanding your place in the universe. So it's a big topic and a little complicated, so this will be more complicated video, so buckle your seatbelts. The idea behind the higher self is that, well, we can use basically a series of logical deductions about where we came from. And logically, it doesn't really make that much sense to consider the if we think of time as being nonlinear, that there was a linear starting point of your existence, right? It's much more likely, I like to use the analogy of colors. So how do we define where the color blue came from, right? So we see something that's blue, or like the nice background of this video. If you look around, the nice aquamarine, or maybe more like navy blue color. Where does that come from? How did it originate? And it just seems so fundamental to the universe. It's not like there was this one point that blue was created. And it's fun to send materialists on a spin who believe in the universe is random and everything is meaningless, and that the universe had a linear beginning, will have a linear end, and then there's nothing left. I mean, this is what a lot of superstitious scientists believe. Not really scientists, more like scientism acolytes. But it's fun to propose this, because they'll say, oh, it's the cones and rods in your eye, and they're just interpreting things as blue. It's like, well, where did the concept of blue come from? Okay, they may try to stretch it out, say, oh, it's just a uniquely human principle. Well, I don't really think that's true, because when you look at a color, when you process a color, first of all, it is something in the environment. It's light being interpreted. So light is manifesting this, well, basically this vibration that creates this unique thing that, how do you define a color? I guess that's the famous kind of riddle. How do you describe the color blue to a blind person? It's impossible. It's like you have to see it to understand it. It's a dimensional concept. It's an elemental force that's in the universe. It cannot really be changed, and it's there, and it even evokes its own special feelings. It's why marketers put things in red when you need to get your attention or be warned about something, and blue is more serene or calm, and things like that. Pink is a little bit more loving and warm. These are like elemental things. So how does this relate to who you are? Well, I would hypothesize that your personality, and I don't just mean like, I mean your real personality, your core essence, your real self, the feeling that somebody gets when they're around you, and you are expressing who and what you really are, which I mean, it's never going to be like a negative thing in this circumstance if you are expressing who you are. Like if an artist is in the moment and you feel them, okay? So if Picasso is doing a sculpture, you feel that essence of who Picasso is. And throughout the history of, poetry and great stories and everything throughout history has, so many stories, so many ideas have centered around finding that real self, right? And so when you feel somebody's real self, it makes sense, if there is no linear time, that this is something that's always existed in the universe. So it's a constant, almost like if you want to go, I guess, God, for lack of a better term, just like creating the color blue, created this elemental force in the universe, which is this very, very unique, very specific manifestation that I guess we call a soul. And it didn't even have a specific beginning point. Possibly, I don't know, maybe things do have linear start times. I really don't know, guys. But one way of looking at it is maybe it's always existed, it's always been there, and at that level, when it's been created, it's kind of close to being like the perfect representation, right? And so that perfect representation, that elemental force, is your higher self. So it is the core concept. Everything else is a derivative. So that core concept then splits like a fractal into all these mirrors of itself, which we call incarnations. And those incarnations, it's like their father, their mother, whatever you want to call it, kind of celestial reproduction, I suppose, is that core elemental concept, and it spawns these incarnations, and all these incarnations have in common that same essence. And so talking to you directly, then you have an elemental essence, which is we call celestial, divine. It's like a color. It's part of the universe. It will never go away, possibly. And you kind of spawned off of that, right? So by this reckoning, we could say a higher self is like the purest representation of a personality. And look, there's a lot of people here with really broken personalities, people who are psychopaths, murderers, thieves. Now, are these people operating from their higher selves? Probably not. That's probably the whole idea. A higher self incarnates itself, but then that incarnation has its own sovereignty. It now is responsible for its own actions. So it's a division of this higher entity, but it has its own free will sovereignty now, so it can make its own choices. And maybe, just maybe, there are some higher selves that are more predisposed to certain behaviors than others, that could create like a psychopath, a monster, a Hitler. And it doesn't mean that higher self would be evil, but let's say there's a higher self essence. I almost want to call it like an essence right now, like a elemental essence that is very, very ambitious and wants to see world change, and also wants to purify the world of negative elements. So all these could be positive ambitions, right? So you could have the ambition to make the world a better place and get rid of negative elements, and that could manifest as somebody who is like some kind of an eco-activist who's out cleaning the oceans, right? In a very positive way. But the incarnation happens, and now you have a new spin on it. So it's an independent entity, and it can make its own decisions and go down a dark path as well, and take out those same attributes, and you get Hitler, right? You wanted to purify the world of negative elements, and we would call that the Holocaust. And he wanted to change the world. We call that, the National Socialists that took over Europe. So it spun itself into a very, very evil area. So does the fact that Hitler has a higher self, does that Does that justify his actions? No, we didn't even get into the really ridiculous areas of the New Age movement. Certain authors I've criticized on this channel before, they will say yes, because the higher self is perfect, therefore Hitler is perfect. And this is probably nothing could be further from the truth. What's more likely in this case is that Hitler has a higher self, and if we can assign some kind of sovereignty or some kind of like its own all-encompassing individual thought to the higher self, then that higher self would be extremely ashamed of what its incarnation had done as Hitler. And maybe even Hitler, if it's contributing and sending information back into the higher self, maybe it damaged or hurt that higher self. Maybe that higher self is now a wounded, broken entity because of what its basically what its child had done. So that's one way of looking at it, and definitely doesn't alleviate responsibility from people. And that's one area I wanted to address. The next area concerns, we can look at it this way then, that the higher self is a personal God. Now, when you read NDEs, I've read hundreds of NDEs, people encounter the higher self, and sometimes it is the light, white light or golden light, and it knows everything about them, and in the way the mystery is revealed that it is them. And this is many advanced NDEs. They report the same thing, and then they will maybe even say, this was my higher self. And in this case, that elemental essence that represents all its incarnations, we could say hundreds, but it could be infinite incarnations. It has that collective, the collective essence that represents you and everything that you could ever be, you ever were. And it's unmistakably you, right? So if you met the higher self of Cyrus and it was like this big golden crazy light, like you would get a serious Cyrus vibe out of it. You'd feel like you just kind of met me, but it was like this crazy supreme version of me, which would be difficult to even describe. But by this reckoning, then you could say the higher self is like your own individual God. And it could be when we get a sense like we are the observer looking at actions in our lives, it's like we're tapping into that higher self consciousness that is separated from its incarnated existence. And so as a soul develops, it may be that it's coming closer and closer in contact with its higher self. Now here is the other really key element, which is that the higher self, as we've described it so far, would, we might be able to see it manifested maybe as some golden light or something like this. But does that golden light, does it have a sovereign life of its own? Does it have an individual existence? Now, here's kind of the big point of this video, so I hope you've been able to bear with me so far. It would kind of make sense that it does not. Why? Because in many, many, many NDEs, we hear a variation of the same story. That I've been incarnated to experience X, Y, Z. I wanted to feel the contrast between light and dark and experience this kind of love and that kind of love. And I wanted to, find out what it's like to be an X, Y, Z. I wanted to be a this, be a that. Enjoyed this type of experience and that type of experience and do all these things, and then kind of send this information back into the higher self again. So with just a little bit of deductive reasoning, it sounds like the state of existence that is the higher self with no incarnation is not able to do any of those things. So you're existing in a super consciousness state, but it's outside of time and space and outside of any kind of physical incarnated existence. And therefore, it might be existing in this state, but it's not able to create things, do things, or any of the things that we incarnate. I didn't want to say reincarnate. That's a kind of a trigger word, right? Just a concept of incarnation, of becoming a branch off, becoming a separate entity that's still connected to the whole. Kind of making a character, so to speak, in the cosmic video game, is necessary to be able to do any of those things, or else in NDEs they wouldn't be saying that that's the reason for incarnation. This is again and again and again. Incarnate to be able to do this stuff. Well, that would mean you cannot do that stuff when you exist just as the higher self. And so by this logic, it would mean that the higher self is dependent upon its incarnations to be able to live life and do things and have an individual existence. And those incarnations are dependent on the higher self to get through life, right? I mean, the higher self, your higher self, is this perfect representation of who and what you are, and we tap into that throughout our lives. And as we tap into it more, we become a more refined personality that is less of an ego. Using the true definition, which would be, a fake personality, as we tap into the essence of who and what we really are, and the elemental personality, then the more refined and perfected and happy our life is. But if we were to completely be the higher self again, we'd again be in that state of existence where we actually can't do anything. It's just a state of consciousness, which is, extremely powerful and all-encompassing, but it's not having unique individual experiences. So we can get as close as we can to the higher self without just becoming that consciousness again. And that would be kind of what spiritual progression is. So that would be the path of self-development. And all of us, everybody you meet, like the base programming code is the higher self. When you meet somebody, they have an unmistakable personality, an unmistakable thing that just makes them what they are, and you feel that's the higher self. When you feel a fake personality coming on, you see somebody covered in bling, and maybe some white guy trying to talk like a black guy. You know what I'm saying, right? When you see someone who's just faking something, then you get that feeling of incongruence. You get this immediate kind of feeling, just a little bit like. That's because they're not operating from the core programming. They're creating this fake thing around themselves, and everybody around that, you feel, you might say things like, this person's not very authentic. And those are the people, of course, especially, who need to do spiritual work to get back to the higher self essence, right? So finally we come to the topic of reincarnation. It is possible, and there is a school of thought. I'm not saying if this is completely accurate or not, but there is a school of thought that reincarnation maybe doesn't exist, or when it does exist, it's quite rare. The thing that is aware of being you is an incarnation that is separated from the higher self, but still connected to the higher self. But when the higher self divides itself, like a cell, you'll see this happening in nature, like a cell divides and it splits off, and then that cell divides, and we could also say it's like a fractal that just, infinitely splintering off. That individual thing, you're only aware of the universe around you, okay? So there is a you that is representative of reality, and this is the reality of you. And we know with higher dimensional consciousness, we can be aware of even multiple existences or be in many places at once, but it's wrapped around the essence of this singular awareness. As an incarnated soul, we can't be everything at once, right? So there is this field, there is this individual perception that happens, which is basically what incarnation is. And with that individual perception, it may be that it doesn't go away. You could take some DMT, or you could have this cosmic merging experience, and then remember that you are God is part of you, and then God is also part of your higher self, and it's all all this stuff that people reveal in these high level NDEs. But when that experience ends, you're again in this incarnated sense, where you are aware of the reality around you. And reincarnation may simply be when your higher self, or even like a level just below the higher self, I think was what we might call group souls, or the group soul. It's a kind of a little bit more incarnated, but not quite. When it starts splitting off and then creating little more incarnations, it's like you're linked to those other incarnations, but only you are aware of being you. So there is this idea that reincarnation doesn't exist, because you'll only be aware of being you. There may not be a time when Cyrus is truly no longer Cyrus. But it may be possible to absorb the thoughts and the consciousness of these incarnations that are split off as you grow in consciousness. And then in this case, Cyrus will no longer be Cyrus so much as maybe the memories and the existences of 50 other people, 100 other people, 200 other people, maybe, entities from other civilizations in the cosmos. Maybe that just keeps growing and expanding. And so as you grow in consciousness, you become all these bigger, greater, more powerful things. So instead of thinking, well, I'm Cyrus, it's like, well, I am the celestial elemental higher self entity that is Cyrus, and also 1,000 other representations of it, all of which are kind of different in a way. But so it may be that many different incarnations start to come back into singular greater incarnations over time. But at this moment, they all have their own individual awarenesses too, which are not truly interconnected. They haven't merged together yet. So in a nutshell, it means that you probably will never stop being. You're not going to die and then get sent back and now you're a squirrel, or now you're this guy, now you're that guy. It's like you'll be in this afterlife environment, this astral plane, which is still an incarnation. You're still a separate entity in a tangible environment, having your own personal existence. And then as you choose to expand your consciousness, you'll become more and more aware of these kind of other facets of yourself. And over a long, long time, by however we want to measure time, all those different facets, they're so aware of each other's thoughts and so interconnected with each other. And you have so much now memory and awareness of previous facets, previous lives, if you will, that over time it all starts to blend together. And it's no longer, one is no longer sure, like, are you Bob, are you Richard, or are you Sally? It's like it all starts to just come together and creates a more collective soul, which is what you may eventually become. And so by this reckoning, reincarnation happens, but it doesn't work like people think it does. And it's also why everybody who seems to die here is still living a life there. I mean, I do think, as a final point, and I know this video is all over the place, but there may be literal reincarnation. I say this because of belief system territories, right? So the Hindu influence is massive. I've been to India, and it's a crazy place. And belief system territories may create the literal reincarnation, where someone's whole soul, whole essence, whole awareness comes back into a new body, because they believe that's what happens, and then they've created this. Same thing could be said if somebody chooses willingly to enter a system like that, like they enter some kind of hierarchical system on the other side that tells them they have to literally reincarnate. And there's been many videos about this, there's many conspiracies about this, and many thoughts that this could be a trap. It could be, a trick to keep somebody in some system again and again and again, and keep them away from the afterlife or whatever, keep them kind of bound as kind of a subservient or a slave, signing a fake spiritual contract. Because somebody doesn't know any better. They didn't study these subjects in this life, and they're they're a naive bunny in the woods, and they don't know what they're doing, and they end up involved in a system like that. So I also think that this kind of thing could happen, and it may also involve some of the reincarnation scientific research. I remember Ian Stevenson was finding reincarnated people because they would have a birthmark, where they were shot, and they'd have the memories of the past life, right? It's things like that. Very crazy stuff. That seems almost like a more literal reincarnation system. And that big surprise tends to happen in societies that believe in that kind of reincarnation. So in that case, yeah, maybe that can happen to you. But clearly it does not happen to most of us, and probably wouldn't happen to anybody in the West who doesn't have that strong belief in doing that type of thing. So So that's a lot. It's a lot to chew on. So I know it's probably a tough video to wrap your mind around. I assure you, books like my first book, it's easier to understand than everything I just went over in this video. So check those out if you want to get a more primer and more like down to earth, if you want to call it that, afterlife related topics. Again, head to afterlifetopics.com to if you want to get involved. You can just links there to the Facebook group to buy books, get involved in classes. All that helps keep this whole show on the road. Thanks for watching. Leave your comments down below. Tell me what you think, and I will see you on the next video.